Hello and welcome to our podcast on the cinematic level and our first term within the cinematic level, framing. Let's go ahead and see what we're talking about. So first off, let's go ahead and define what we mean by the cinematic level. These are the items in a movie that make a movie a movie. Basically, this is the stuff you can see in film that you can't see anywhere else in terms of studying text. And what we mean is this. The cinematic level differs from the literary level because this is the stuff that film has in common with literature, setting, characters, motifs, theme. The cinematic level is also different from the dramatic level, and this is the stuff in film that is in common with live theater, actor choice, costuming, makeup, hair, set design. And so as we move through all the different elements of the cinematic level, we have to ask ourselves, why is this level so important? Well, this is the stuff that makes movies movies. We can only see certain things in the text of film. We can't have the same types of special effects in live theater, and we certainly don't have special effects in literature. We certainly don't have editing in live theater, the show must go on kind of stuff. But what makes the cinematic level so important is that this level is the grammar of film. Just like we have the grammar in writing where a semicolon means something, that the difference between who and whom means something in writing or literature, a high angle in film means something consistently. A close-up consistently means the same thing, or a certain type of edit can mean something. And so we need to understand the literal level of what these things are that we're seeing on screen. But more importantly, we have to move to the interpretive level. What is the grammar of that choice at the cinematic level? What is the director trying to say through that cinematic choice? Why would they choose a high angle there? Why would they choose that kind of motion? Why would they choose that kind of sound right here, right now? Because as we observe and pay attention to these different choices, as always, it will help us understand and interpret a potential theme from this particular text. And so what's cool about the cinematic level is there seem to be two major patterns that we've observed over the years. The first one is that the cinematic level seems to reinforce the dramatic and literary level. And so what we mean is this. As we're watching a movie, we seem to just naturally understand the power relationships in a scene. And we can tell that two characters aren't getting along. And then all of a sudden, tension-filled music comes in. That's a cinematic choice to add that sinister or tension-filled music. You don't get that in a novel. Or perhaps, same type of scene, two characters are fighting, and all of a sudden the camera angle goes to a really high angle and a Dutch angle, and it shows us what we already knew. The characters are fighting. The camera angles reinforce that which we already knew. So it seems like the literary level came first. Characters are going to fight. And then the cinematic level comes along later to reinforce that which we naturally understand. The other pattern, which is super cool in film and something we just can't get at the literary or the dramatic level, is where the cinematic level reveals the other levels. So for example, a character walks on screen for the first time. We don't know anything about this character. We've never heard of him yet. We've never seen him yet. No characters have even talked about this other dude that's walking on. But as this character walks on, all of a sudden, change in camera angle. All of a sudden, change in framing. Perhaps all of a sudden, change in the musical score. Without that character even opening his or her mouth, without seeing that character dressed in all black, which would be a dramatic level choice, the cinematic level reveals something about what's going to happen. The music gives it away, the framing, the editing. And so in this case, it seems like the cinematic level comes first. The cool things that film can offer us give us hints about what we're about to see. And so what are the cinematic level elements that we're going to focus on in this course? The second half of this podcast talks about framing choices, but we also will explore camera angles and camera motion, lighting, sound, and editing. And so you'll hear me say this over and over within our class. We need to move from just summary and observation to analysis, asking ourselves, what am I supposed to interpret or infer from this moment? And so here are the same 3 steps that we will say throughout the entire semester. In order to deeply analyze any text, we have to go through these steps. Number 1, we have to observe what is being presented to us. Whether we're reading a piece of literature in a novel or short story form, or we are seeing a piece of live theater, or we are watching a movie, we must read and watch actively. We have to observe what we are presented with, whether that be a motif or whether that be a camera angle. Number 2, we have to track these elements, whether that's the literary motif or irony or foreshadowing, or it's a cinematic element like framing or motion or editing. We have to track and write it down. There's no way that we can watch a 2-hour movie or read a 300-page novel and not write things down. We won't be able to attend to the details. So once we've observed that one of these elements is going on, we need to write them down and keep a log of all that we have seen. And then step number 3 is the hardest one, the one that you're kind of on your own for. We have to think deeply. And so this is a step that is not really visible to the teacher. We have to trust that you guys are thinking deeply about what you have seen and the pattern that has been presented to you. Why did they make this consistent choice with lighting? Why did they make this consistent choice with editing? Why did they make this consistent choice with color palette? And if we can think deeply and offer a reasonable and valid interpretation, that gets us one step closer to deducing theme, the lesson of this text. What are we supposed to learn about ourselves through watching this text? So let's talk about framing, our first cinematic level element. So first off, what is framing? Framing is defined as how the object in the shot will be positioned and filmed. Another way of saying it is how much of the frame will the object occupy? So think about the square of a movie, the letterbox format that you are watching, the 4 corners of your screen. Framing decides how much of that square frame will be filled by an object. And again, we have to observe the different types of framing that we're going to talk about, but then we have to think deeply about why they would choose that framing at that moment. And already, cinematic framing is going to distance ourselves from dramatic level choices. Because if the dramatic level is basically what film has in common with theater, the cinematic level is different. In live theater, the frame never changes. It's always the 4 squares of the theater stage that you're looking at. The director can't really force you to look at any one thing through a close-up. As an audience member in a piece of live theater, you are free to look wherever you want in that live theater stage. Yes, this character of Shakespeare might be front and center. Yes, he might have special lighting on him. He might have special costuming on to draw our attention. But we are free as viewers to look anywhere within that frame. As we move to the cinematic level, though, we are sometimes forced by directors to look at something specific. When a director chooses a close-up, we have to look at what the director wants us to. We can't say, I don't really want to look at this character's watch. I want to see what their expression is like. In film, you can't do that, because the cinematic element of framing shows the director's choice of how much an object will fill a screen. So the first framing choice we'd like to mention is what we call a medium shot. And this is defined as a shot when the object in the frame is kind of about from the waist up. Probably most of the movies we watch use medium shots about 80% of the time. And the reason is, literally, this is a very normal angle. We are seeing the film world very comparably to how we see our world. We're all kind of about the same height and size, and so when we look out at somebody walking toward us in the hallway, we see them in a medium shot. We are looking at them, they're filling our field of vision, pretty normal. This is how we see our world. If we move to the interpretive level, though, this medium shot is probably telling us that the situation is pretty normal. There's nothing really extraordinary going on. Nobody's really in charge of anybody else. Nobody has very low power in this relationship. Everything's on an even keel, and it feels very neutral, and it feels very normal. So here's some examples.
And tan and young and lovely, the girl from Ipanema goes walking.
So the second example of framing choices is what we call a long shot. And this is where the frame is very wide and it takes in a very large horizon. And so because we can see so much of the setting in a long shot, we often call these establishing shots because this establishes where the action is going to take place. We can see the city skyline of Chicago. Therefore, we know that this is where this story is going to take place. And so literally, a long shot can show us where the action is taking place. We know this is in San Francisco or Washington, D.C. or some foreign country. We can tell because a lot of the setting and the horizon is captured. Also, literally, we could be looking at something very small on screen. So perhaps we are taking in a massive setting, but we're supposed to be focusing on something very, very small, like people walking or a car moving along the horizon. And so literally, those objects are very small. And because those objects are so small, they may seem very unclear or indistinct, almost as if they're blending in to the horizon or to the setting that they are in. But then as we move to the interpretive level and we ask ourselves, what is the director saying through this long shot? We get to a couple things. One is just setting the location. So we don't really have to interpret that. They're just telling us where it takes place. But the other two give us some interpretive moments. This might be a feeling of importance. If we film some sort of landmark on a very grand scene with some sort of humongous long shot and it fills that screen because it's so big, then that item is going to be important. It's probably going to matter later in the film. At the same time, if we go to the other example we mentioned, if we have a massive long shot, a huge open horizon, and we have a tiny little object that we're supposed to focus on, perhaps it gives us a feeling of isolation, that car or those people, they're so minuscule and powerless in this setting, that we know that they have very little power in this text because of how they were filmed in a long shot. And so here's some examples.
And tan and young and lovely, the girl from Ipanema goes walking, and when she passes, each one she passes goes. When she walks, she's like a samba that swings so cool.
The third framing choice we'd want to talk about is the close-up. And by definition, this is when the object in focus takes up about 80% of the screen space. And basically, as a viewer, we are forced to look only at what the director wants us to. This is one of those huge differences between dramatic live theater and cinematic film. In live theater, we could just look wherever we want. But here in a close-up on film, we have to look at what they want us to look at. And so what are the effects of a close-up? Literally, whatever we're looking at is very large. So all of a sudden, if we're in the AMC theater and we're looking at somebody's cell phone screen that is normally 3 by 4 inches, all of a sudden it's 20 feet by 40 feet. It is literally very big. The director has forced us to look at something, and oftentimes we can see emotions or reactions to something because we can't really see if a character's crying when filmed in a long shot. We have to be very close to see something that's subtle. As we move to the interpretive level, we have to look at the grammar of a close-up. Why do directors typically choose close-ups at various points? Well, one, it could just be a size thing. If the item is very small and the director needs us to see the magic dime trick or a ring or some sort of insect that's going to matter later in the film, they're going to have to use a close-up. So it could just be something about size. Something is very small and we need to see it in a larger fashion. But more interpretively, whatever is being framed in a close-up is probably going to be important. If the director is going to change the flow, where we see most of our movies in a medium shot, and they're going to change the flow to put something in a close-up, whatever has been close-upped on is probably going to be important. It could be something just symbolic, a one-time thing in a text that we pay attention to that's very symbolic. It could also be what we call a dangling cause or foreshadowing. We need to pay attention to this tiny detail because later in the film, it's going to come true or matter later. Additionally, that close-up item could be a motif, a recurring pattern in film, and the director needs us to see this pattern again. Oh wait, one more time. Oh, hang on, one more time. So again, the literal level, whatever is in a close-up is very large, but interpretively, whatever's in a close-up is very important. And our job is to pay attention and notice that something has been made into a close-up, track when those are used, and then analyze and think deeply about why they would make this framing choice at this particular moment. And here are some examples.
And tan and young and lovely, the girl from Ipanema goes walking, and when she passes, each one she passes goes. When she walks, she's like.
So that's our introduction to the cinematic level and our first term of framing. Just remember, the cinematic level is the stuff that film has that is unique to film. Camera angles, camera motion, editing, special effects, things like that. You're not going to get the same stuff in a dramatic live theater production, and you're certainly not going to get the same stuff reading at the literary level of a novel or a short story. Framing in specific, we talk about 3 major framing choices. The most normal, the one that we see like all the time, is the medium shot. That's kind of how we see our world. Then we have the long shot from very far away, establishing location, establishing mood. And then we have the close-up, where the object in the frame fills about 80% of that frame. But not only do we have to observe and track what we see, but the main point of all this is, what does this mean? What is our analysis of why they would make this choice right now in this film? So as we move from summary and observation to analysis, another tool that we have at our disposal is the idea of framing. Let's pay attention to what kind of things end up on screen in our films. As always, thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions, please bring those into class. Otherwise, thanks, and we'll see you soon.